established in support of the Sustainable Development Goals by the UN, and continues to be a senior policy advisor to the SDSN. And so Glenn is known to some of us, and he's visited us before. And in fact, we've grabbed him in the middle of what seems like a multi-country tour at the moment, and so delighted that he's around and ready to speak to us. He's going to be talking on, as many of you know, one of the Sustainable Development Goals. This is the goal number 2, so to speak. It's actually quite an ambitious goal, and it says to end hunger, achieve food security, improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. So all a number of different things clubbed together under this one major goal, which is quite challenging. And Professor Glenn Denning is very well placed to speak to this issue. He's been teaching a core course in global food systems at Columbia, and given his involvement with the Earth Institute and also with the SDG process, it's a great opportunity. So I think I'll pass it on to Professor Denning, and we'll probably maybe you can speak for about 35, 40 minutes, so we'll give about 15 minutes for questions towards the end.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. So thanks for the introduction, and thanks very much for coming here on a Friday afternoon. I know myself as somebody who organizes these talks. We pray that a group will actually show up for the visitor, and I've got to say I'm most impressed that such a group would turn out. It can't be me; it must be the topic, which I think you're right. It is an important topic that we need to be talking about. Second thing is we actually start on time, which is also impressive. So Monash University and the center. Thanks for that. We've SDG2. It is in fact a horrendously large, sort of far-reaching, and some would say far-fetched set of objectives to bring together in one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Ending hunger, achieving food security, and improved nutrition, and promoting sustainable agriculture, and to do this within a time frame of 15 years. All the SDGs are basically looking at 2030 as the point at which these visions will be turned into reality. So what I'm going to do today is first of all sort of walk you through to the point where we are today. It always helps to look back and see how far have we come, where are we right now, and therefore how realistic is this kind of a goal that the world community is sort of set itself for the next 15 years. Being a little bit professorial, I always like to sort of put a little bit of a historical background to all this, and in some ways to actually pat ourselves on the back for quite a remarkable achievement when you think of it. At the dawn of the Neolithic era, perhaps 12,000 years ago, agriculture started. The actual first domestication of crops took place, and other domestications of other food crops have taken place over the thousands of years since then. But if you really think of it, 12,000 years ago, the population, there weren't very good census surveys out at that time, but I've seen numbers of around 10 million people living on this planet. Fast forward to 2016, and I checked again this morning, and it's 7.4 billion. Plus a few, and you think of that from 10 million, and as I always say, the size of New York, the population of a little bit more than New York City, to 7.4 billion people today. Imagine the strains we've put on the planet in trying to sustain people, that many people on this planet over that period. Lots of things happened in between, and I said the domestication of various crops. A lot of it in the early part of domestication was simply farmers going around identifying varieties that they liked, collecting the seed, replanting, and slow improvement over time through selection. Revolutionized about 150 to 200 years, 150 years ago, with the first experiments on breeding and crossbreeding, through to a real revolution that took place in the United States during the early part of the 20th century with the application and commercialization of hybrid corn, to the point where by the 1940s all American farmers grew hybrid corn. And through to today, which draws all kinds of fascination, but also controversy around the kinds of genetic modifications that are currently possible with plants and also with animals. So, as I said, quite a remarkable achievement on the positive side, in the sense that somehow we've been able to produce a global food system that more or less sustains 7.4 billion people. But it's come at some cost, and obviously the footprint of agriculture is large, that 38% or so of the Earth's land surface is covered in one kind of agriculture or another, including pastoralists and grazing and so on. 70% of the fresh water that's extracted from rivers and underground sources and so on is used for agriculture. And up to about 30% of greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture, either directly from agriculture, which is about half of that, or indirectly through other processes that are related to agriculture, including deforestation. So it's a fairly major piece of the global warming story, and it has been for some time. So thinking about sustainable agriculture, which is now mentioned as part of SDG2, it's not a new concept. Again, we can go back to really sort of the middle of the 19th century, and the first agricultural research, formalized agricultural research, started in the UK. Long-term trials were established at that time, but importantly, the first experiments that looked at soil fertility improvement, recognizing that as England became more and more urbanized and more and more folks lived in London with the Industrial Revolution and Birmingham and different other parts of the country, nutrients were being accumulated in urban areas, and it wasn't very practical to take those nutrients back to the farm. So the whole concept of coming up with some form of fertilization took place, and some of the earliest work took place at Rothamsted there. That was followed in the early 20th century by the Haber-Bosch process, which enabled us to capture the nitrogen in the atmosphere. An industrial process led to 2 Nobel Prizes, but essentially was transformative in terms of being able to bring nutrients from the sky into farmers' fields, and was really an important part of the agricultural revolution, both in the northern climates, but later in the tropics. So a lot of progress in the northern climates during the late 19th century and early 20th century, but very little had been achieved in the tropics. And this was the time in the 1960s when many were really expecting disasters. That the specter of Thomas Malthus, the idea that we would be greeted by gigantic inevitable famines that would stalk the earth. He was writing about this in 1798, that it wouldn't be possible to provide enough food given population growth on the planet. And the way that countries like India and Bangladesh, wasn't Bangladesh back then, but Pakistan and so on, the way they were looking, it seemed as we were headed for great disasters. But the Green Revolution, which I'm not going to go into any detail on, led initially by Norman Borlaug, who won the 1970 Nobel Peace Prize, really came up with the idea that if we develop technology in the tropics for the tropics, we would be able to meet those food security challenges of those areas. So he started with wheat, and about the same time, and in the Philippines, the International Rice Research Institute was established in 1960. to develop what was called the miracle rice varieties. These were new rice varieties that were higher yielding, more responsive to fertilizer and good management conditions. And this actually did create a revolution. I spent about almost 20 years of my career at the International Rice Research Institute, not during this golden age of the 1960s, thankfully, but later in the 80s and into the 90s. But really, this was the hub of innovation, developing technologies that would improve productivity for small-scale farmers. And these varieties really spread like wildfire across Asia from the late 60s into the 70s and beyond. So what was the impact? Well, between 1970 and 1995, cereal production, which was really rice and wheat in Asia. So over that period of about 25 years, cereal production doubled in Asia. So this is a huge leap. It was mainly through the introduction of high-yielding varieties combined with fertilizer and irrigation. At the same time, the population of Asia increased by 60%. So you can see food has jumped ahead and kind of proven Malthus wrong, at least for now. Productivity improved at a much faster rate than population. And at the same time, the land area dedicated to agriculture, to cereal production, increased by only 4%. So in fact, it was intensification. It was largely intensification of existing land, more productivity out of that existing land. And this really laid very much the platform for what was viewed for some time as the structural transformation that took place in Asia, where you had large numbers of people actually moving out of agriculture into urban areas, benefiting from the incomes that were raised, the education and improved health conditions that occurred as a result of the improvements and adoption of technology, coupled with investments in urban areas. So you had more manufacturing, more service industries, but at the same time it was on the back of improved agricultural productivity. So that was observed. So if we look at that, and it sounds like a great success story, and of course there are wrinkles in that story. There were environmental, health, and equity issues that have, over the decades, have come up. Many of them have been addressed through changes in the technology itself, the overuse of fertilizers, the overuse of pesticides, and the health impacts of that. In some cases, it continues to this day that those criticisms are valid. The inequity arguments are less valid than they were in the sense that it was a fairly divisible technology, meaning that relatively small-scale farmers could adopt the technology, even low-income farmers with very small plots of land. Landless laborers were benefiting, and even urban consumers were benefiting because the price of food was maintained very low because of the high productivity. So fast forward now to last year, 2015. So in 2015, every year, FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, brings out its state of food insecurity in the world. And for the first time, it had dropped below 800 million. I don't know whether we should cheer and say, this is amazing, what a great achievement, or we should say, we still have 795 million people on the planet who are undernourished or going hungry. This is purely, the FAO indicator is purely based on energy, meeting energy requirements. It doesn't say anything directly about nutrition quality. But anyway, it was progress. It was viewed as progress. 72 countries had achieved the Millennium Development Goal, particularly MDG-1C, which was about halving hunger. So the goal was to halve hunger. 72 countries had done. Many countries, of course, did not achieve that. So from the benchmark for the Millennium Development Goals was 1990 to 2015. The percentage of people, this is globally now, who were hungry, who hadn't, their energy requirements had not been met, decreased from 23 to about 12.9. So globally, more or less, pretty close to it, considering the errors and the inaccuracies of these measurements, we were able to achieve the Millennium Development Goal. Now, of course, there were vast differences between countries, and I'll just highlight a couple here. A lot of it was done on the back of China. So this is the percentage reduction in the number of undernourished, a big significant number of reduction in success in China, success in Vietnam, success in Thailand, success in Myanmar. I have some questions about the data there. I'm not sure how accurate that was because the military were controlling the data for a lot of that period. Lack of success in Pakistan, lack of success in Afghanistan, lack of success in DPR Korea, North Korea. So you can draw a few inferences, like from that, but just to say there's a huge amount of variability, and simply achieving the MDG on a global scale really says nothing on an individual scale. So we have to go back and see what happens at the individual level. A similar story in Africa. The MDG target 1C, the hunger one, is dark green if the MDG was achieved, and you can see that it's a bit spotty. A number of countries in West Africa, Ethiopia, Mozambique, South Africa, Angola, a few of those places achieved that. The reds are definitely off track. So they were not going to achieve the MDG, right? So it's a big kind of a mixture. These white patches here, we just don't have the numbers to know what's the case. So let's look at all that sort of collectively. What's the scorecard? In terms of the global food system, where are we today? As I said, more or less, we're provisioning for 7.3 billion people. I need to update it to 7.4. Just under 800 million people, 1 in 9, are still going hungry. 2 billion people have micronutrient deficiencies, the so-called hidden hunger. Almost 160 million children are stunted. And by stunted, it's a low height per age, right? So their growth is stunted, and that has all kinds of implications in terms of their cognitive abilities and their future earning potential. 3.1 million children die from malnutrition-related causes annually. But this is literally the big one, and that is that we now have 1.9 billion adults overweight. We have 600 million who are obese. It's a remarkable statistic. It's 2.5 times the undernourished are the overnourished. Okay. Moreover, the Global Nutrition Report last year, which is tracking nutrition both under and over, found that there is not a single country on the planet so far that has been able to reverse this trend. We've been good at reversing undernutrition, but nobody has found a way yet to reverse the overnutrition. And just to throw in something else, about a third of all the food that's produced is wasted, okay, is lost or wasted somewhere in the value chain. So we're now going to go from MDG 1C specifically on hunger, to SDG2. And as I said, you can't see it back there, but just to remind you, ending hunger. This was only halving hunger, don't forget. Now we're saying by 2030 we'll end hunger. We'll achieve food security and we'll improve nutrition, and all of that will be done within the context of agriculture, which is sustainable. We will promote sustainable agriculture. So it's one of 17 goals. Now, I don't know if any of your lecturers or professors have forced you to memorize the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Jeff Sachs did that for our class. He was insistent, and he would SDG 7, what is it? No, 15. So you go around the class and make sure everybody was sort of sufficiently terrorized to remember it, or have a great little cheat sheet just in front of them that they could glance down and be able to do that. But the thing about this is people say, 17 goals, that's crazy. I mean, it's too complicated, it's too big an agenda. Goodness, we didn't even achieve the Millennium Development Goals with all that hard work we put into it. The problem is that when you go through these 17 goals, there's two things about it. Firstly, the 17 goals were prepared through a political process. The Open Working Group. This was done by diplomats getting their heads together with all kinds of advisors in New York over a period of more than a year. Cats being herded, towards sustainable development, which you know, a lot of folks really, including Jeff Sachs at some points, was saying, you know, I'm not sure we're going to get a set of sustainable development goals. But out of all that came 17 goals. All right, and if you go through them word by word, these are just little catchwords, catchphrases, but I really would ask anybody to, like, do you disagree with any of these goals? Would you say these are unimportant, these are not relevant, these are not appropriate? It's really hard to do that. So they are relevant, and they need to be considered in their totality. And I tend to gravitate towards SDG2 because that's what I've been doing, but even SDG2, you know, if you're talking about nutrition, you're talking about health, you're talking about education, you're talking about gender equality, clean water and sanitation, the utilization of food is incredibly important. And just jump down to the bottom row, climate action, climate. Agriculture contributes to climate change and is highly vulnerable to climate change. Biodiversity, below water, on land, peace and security. How important is that for food security? So, in fact, this story of the SDG2 has, you know, its tentacles reach into most of the other sustainable development goals. So, this is what I won't go into these details, but there are a set of targets. So you've got this hierarchy of, you've got the 17 goals, you've got 169 targets, and we weren't asked to remember the 169 targets. And now, as of last week, we've got, I didn't add them up, but I guess it's about 300 indicators, right? Something like that. And it is pretty mind-blowing, but it is what it is. These are the goals. This is the framework that governments, international agencies, NGOs will by and large be using to guide their investments, to guide their programs over the coming 15 years. As I mentioned last week, finally the Statistical Commission drew some conclusions on what would be the indicators. So they've got 15 indicators for those 7 or 8 targets under SDG2. And again, I'm not going to go into the details. You're going to have to study up this stuff yourself. But I will point you towards how difficult it is to put a lot of this stuff into action. Not that you would be surprised, but I just pulled out a couple. The stunting one is fine. We're measuring stunting. But look at this one, the percentage of agricultural area under sustainable agricultural practices. Can you go out and measure that in Australia or in Timor or wherever? I mean, it's insane. I mean, we have to define what is sustainable. This is even worse, I think. The percentage of agricultural households using eco-friendly fertilizers, right? Eco-friendly fertilizers. Now, I know what they're getting at, but that's not what it takes. If we want to actually implement these goals and try and achieve those targets, we will ultimately need to have a set of indicators that make some sense to the people on the ground, right? So I'm going to Timor on Sunday, and I'll be working with the people in the Prime Minister's office who are responsible for monitoring and evaluation progress towards sustainable development. So I say, you know, why don't you go out and measure the percentage of households using eco-friendly fertilizers? What on earth is that, you know? What on earth is that in the context of anything, let alone of East Timor? So it's going to be very challenging. So implementation is really the holy grail now. We've got to be able to implement. And I just wanted to put this in a little bit of context. It's not a static system. The world's food system is changing dramatically. We have some very powerful demand factors. Urbanization is one, and changing dietary patterns is another. This is changing the demand for quantities and particular types of food. As people urbanize, I think you could work that out pretty easily. They often end up eating different things. Okay, they value their time differently. They cook differently. They move much more towards processed food. They tend to go towards some of these high energy, high sugar foods. Incomes increase often in association with urbanization, increased meat consumption. Okay, all kinds of meat consumption. China is a wonderful example of that. There's a whole revolution around the supply chains, what people are referring to as the supermarket revolution. If you're interested in that work by Tom Reardon and others, it's amazing the extent to which the supermarket, not necessarily the big, sort of Coles that you have here, but small-scale stores that stock lots of fresh and processed and packaged commodities. It's everywhere. It's in the heart of Africa. People are shopping through supermarkets. It's spread throughout the world, and it changes the whole relationship between farmers and consumers. And on the production side, on the supply side, there are changes in the particular factor markets, and one of those to emphasize is land, how the whole basis of land and how land is used and owned is changing. And I just draw your attention to what's often referred to as the land grab in Africa, where a lot of investment, foreign as well as domestic investment, is going into large-scale agricultural enterprises at the expense often of small-scale farming. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it can be. It can have negative effects on food security. It can have negative effects on the environment. And financing, the way that farmers access finance, the advent of the mobile phone and so on, is really changing the way food is supplied, agriculture is performed. Changing agricultural technologies. There's a whole bunch of things going on here that you're probably more skilled at than I am. But mechanization, cost of labor goes up. That's natural. People are moving to cities. People value their time more in rural areas now. They don't want to spend their whole day out there transplanting or plowing the field. Mechanization is taking place at a very high rate. New information technologies, the use of GPS systems to improve land leveling, for example, the use of mobile phones for accessing information, for moving money around. I mean, Kenya, Tanzania, and other places are becoming very famous for this. They're able to move money around using mobile phones, and that is transforming the way they undertake their agriculture. They're able to access market information they never could before, and that's improving the efficiency of the systems. Very precise technological breeding methods are used. And again, I don't want to open a Pandora's box or can of worms or whatever you want to call it about the GMO story. But generally speaking, we can do much more today in terms of being able to manipulate the genotypes of the plants and animals that we have to meet some of the challenges that we're facing, including, for example, here, there's some rice varieties that have resistance to submergence. Now, with climate change, we're getting more occasions when we have submergence of rice paddies. The whole field's submerged, not just water on the fields. And all sorts of other abiotic and biotic stresses. And now it's spreading its influence also on nutrition. And this is kind of the poster child of, I would call pro-poor GMOs, and that is golden rice. So having a rice variety that has high beta-carotene, which enables, basically, is the precursor of vitamin A, which has the potential to reduce vitamin A deficiency, which kills or maims 1 million children a year around the world. So, this kind of these technological breakthroughs, whether it's GPS or access to the internet or biotechnology, it's changing the game in terms of supply. The key points I want to make are this. If we want to achieve a sustainable food system going forward, in my view, based on 30-odd years of working in the agriculture sector, of trying to get a grip of how to make all this practical, I think there's 4 basic programmatic areas of focus we need to pay attention to. And I think it's true in almost all settings. 1, to improve productivity, meaning to produce more, hopefully with less, or at least more from the same resources that we're currently using. Secondly, improve distribution and access. So it's not just about the amount, it's about how those amounts of food are distributed. Now, there are lots of arguments, and it's a sort of a throwaway statement that there's plenty of food for everybody. We just need to redistribute it. You could say the same with water and most other things. But the reality is you still need to improve productivity in order to make that production more basically sustainable over time, and to make sure that production is taking place in the places that it should take place. Reducing food loss and waste, I mentioned 30% of the food or more that we have is thrown away, and shifting to healthier diets surely can result in some positive, more sustainable reformation even of our food system, and we can talk about a little bit about that in the Q&A if you like. So these four together, let me just say a couple of specific things, what I mean by that. For improving productivity, it's really about efficient use of resources. Don't forget, agriculture is all about generating food from your land, from your labor, from the nutrients that you have access to, from your water and from your energy. So you need to be able to produce more from the same amounts, and hopefully more from less of those resources. We should be aiming to reduce or limit the conversion of forest or wetlands or grasslands to agriculture. So we need to be reducing the environmental impact. It's conceivable if we improve productivity, we can actually shrink the area we dedicate to agriculture while maintaining the amount of supply that we need. Conserving biodiversity is important because it conserves important genetic resources, and it makes sure that we can use those genetic resources to our own good in the future. Climate smart production systems are going to be important. And let me just say something about this. We always talk about climate smart agriculture and climate smart landscapes. So agricultural systems that are able to adapt to and be resilient to climate. We tend to look at it usually on the biophysical side, but there's a very strong social side I want to emphasize in this as well, and there's examples coming from India, where there's increased evidence of farmers taking their own lives in response to drought. Okay, the science is still a little bit all over the place, but anecdotally, there seems to be more and more evidence of this. And it's not just in India. One of the few studies that I did come across that looked at this was actually from Australia. And I believe it was from these people from ANU and I think CSIRO. With this study, they looked at suicide and drought in New South Wales. And fascinating, they found, probably not surprisingly, that males, with the severity of the drought, the index of the severity of the drought, male suicide in the age group of 30 to 49 significantly increased, and in women it decreased over that same period. Very interesting. I don't know, it's not the time to discuss it, but it's a fascinating paper that I throw out there, just that we start to think about climate change as not just about, oh, we'll have less production, we'll have variations in supply of food and greater price fluctuations, but there are also social impacts in India, in Australia, and wherever climate change is affecting us. In terms of distribution, it's about infrastructure, it's about safety nets, empowerment of women, policies, and complementary development of alternatives so people can access food through income, not necessarily just through producing. I mentioned food waste. There's two different parts to this. One aspect is more in the developing country context. Most of the losses occur at the farm level and in the transport to urban areas. In the wealthier settings like Melbourne and richer countries, it's much more at the retail and consumer level. And through all of this, there are opportunities for technology, for education, improvements in infrastructure, advocacy, and policies to make a difference there. But we can. And one of the new SDGs really does address sustainable production and consumption. So it's an important part of our agenda. And as I mentioned earlier, shifting to healthier diets. And the bottom line, according to Michael Pollan, is eat food not too much, and mostly plants. With all the advice out there, that is something that hopefully would lead at the same time to healthier diets and more sustainable agriculture. But again, it affects producers. What they produce affects consumers and what they consume. So these are the four that I think are the key. If I have 3 more minutes, I just wanted to say we've got, these are the ideas that I think if we could put into place, it would really make a difference. And at the SDG summit in September, Pope Francis got up and made a very nice speech, and he made the comment that solemn commitments are not enough. What will it actually take to make a difference? And I've sort of nailed it down, I think, to these 8 areas. Behavioral change, and I believe there's a conference or a meeting going on today organized by the Monash Sustainability Institute on that. Community ownership, new systems of education, and I think Monash and others should be looking at that, looking at much more multi-sectoral, multidisciplinary approaches to problem solving, unleashing innovation, and I've talked about mobile phones and the role of the internet, investments that are sustainable over time. I think effective implementation, I think there should be institutes of implementation, actually. We're very good at coming up with recommendations and priorities and goals and targets and indicators. We're not too good at implementation. And all of the leaders I talk to, including the Prime Minister of Timor-Leste, he said, we need to improve our ability to implement. We've even got resources. We've got money, we've got oil, or gas, but we need to learn how to implement. Accountability mechanisms, yes, we can implement, but we've got to measure it and we've got to make ourselves accountable. And political leadership. I always use this example. Dr. Mutharika, the former president of Malawi, he introduced a very controversial fertilizer subsidy scheme in Malawi, which myself, Jeffrey Sachs, and a couple of others supported him wholeheartedly for. But man, were we hammered by the World Bank, by DFID, all the European donors. They said, no, these are subsidies. These are not appropriate. It's a slippery slope. It's not sustainable. I tell you, a population of 13 million and 5 million people were starving, literally. 5 million out of 13. That wasn't very sustainable either. And each year, the president would wait for the World Food Program to come in and bring, generous donations, and somehow people would survive and they'd go back another year. So we talked about subsidizing through fertilizer. It's been going for 10 years. He said, enough is enough. I'm not going to get down on my knees and beg for food. Let's grow the food ourselves, and indeed we have. It's been going for 10 years. Look at, read about it. It's considered controversial, but it has basically kept Malawi in food for the last 10 years, while hopefully we can move to a more sustainable system. This is my last slide, and these are my key messages. This is what I'd like you to go away with, if possible, and I think the first one is that, if we reflect on it, the global food system is indeed a remarkable achievement. I mean, we don't have anything to compare it with, except maybe if you saw the Martian, one person trying to grow potatoes in that sort of setting. But okay, we've probably got a better environment here on Earth, but 7.4 billion people, right? But malnutrition in its various forms, and as I mentioned, the overweight, obesity, the overnutrition piece is growing very fast. We have serious questions still about sustainability and resilience. I think we have some solutions as to how to make our food system, our agriculture, and related aspects of the food system more sustainable and more resilient. I think SDG2 plus, those other goals that relate to SDG2, provides an impetus for action. I think we know what to do, those sort of 4 areas that I've emphasized, but how to do it is the central challenge. So, you all came here wondering whether SDG2 was an impossible dream. I will ask you what you think. We'll leave it at that. Thank you. So, questions, comments, most welcome.
Thank you very much. And
I went 2 minutes over.
No, but so questions one.
So, you had a couple of words up there which I wanted you to explain. Because you had, under productivity, you had the yield gap and the yield potential.
Yes.
It seems like you spend a lot of time, maybe because of your background, talking about, genetic variety.
Right.
Ways of improving total production.
Right.
But is the challenge more that we've just got underutilized land? Even if we could deal with the shortage of food simply by reducing the yield gap, which I understand. Is that?
Yeah. No, you're right, and I was watching the clock a bit, and I sort of skipped over that a little bit. But certainly there are large parts of the planet where we could really significantly reduce the yield gap, and your own experience with the yield gap on coffee in Timor would be a good one. But if we look at, for example, Malawi and the corn, the maize crop in Malawi, the yield for 20 years was 1 ton per hectare. With a fertilizer subsidy program, the national yield easily just became 2 to 2.5 tons per hectare. I've grown crops of maize in Malawi where I've consistently got 5, 6, 7 tons per hectare. So there's a huge yield gap. You go to Iowa, rain-fed corn farming, rain-fed maize, the same species, a different variety, different setting, the farmers get 10 tons per hectare every year. So there's yield gaps all over the place. I don't expect Malawi to get 10 tons, but I would expect them to get 3 to 4 tons if they wanted. Now, but that's got to be done. So we've got to close that gap, and there's much that can be done. There are parts of the world, like Africa, like sub-Saharan Africa, where the gap it's possible to close it. But there are a lot of constraints in doing that, the cost of the inputs that are needed to do that. Often the varieties don't exist that are well adapted to be able to absorb that increase in production. But other parts of the world, like China, for example, northeastern China over-fertilizes. We actually need to reduce fertilizer applications in parts of China, right? And reduce the impact that that's having on groundwater and ultimately having on people's health. And it can be done without any reduction in yield. So we're not actually closing the gap, we're actually improving efficiency in that case. But I think other parts of the world are still really, it's hard to get more production, and therefore I think it makes sense to make genetic improvements that might improve productivity. But for me, the real answer on the role of the genetic improvement, it's to improve adaptation. It's to improve nutritional quality. It's to improve resistance to pests and diseases so we can reduce our dependency on chemicals that are often harmful to health and harmful to the environment. You can do the pointing. Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Hey, so you mentioned that China was a massive sort of input in this improvement. Why do you think that is? Do you think it has anything to do with the structure of government over there, or do you think there's other reasons?
Well, I've often looked at China and compared it to Africa, right? Like there's several things going on there, right? And it's difficult to disentangle which is the most important factor.
Any key driver?
Which is?
Any key drivers?
Well, certainly a lot of China's success has to do with infrastructure investments and social investments. Probably Cicero would answer these better than I would, but the fact is that the agricultural areas of China are relatively well connected through physical infrastructure, through road networks. So the ability to move inputs in and outputs out is much greater in a place like China. China has a massive coastline. It has access to international trade, both for exports and for imports. So it really helps to have a coastline. I think it's 16 African countries out of 54 have no coastline, and they're typically the most food insecure. So being connected to markets is very helpful. China they've long invested in education as well. So a lot of the scientific advances, for example, in rice production, has actually come from China. When I was working at the International Rice Research Institute, our most effective collaborators were generally Chinese institutions, and they were really at the cutting edge of a lot of this stuff. So they were investing in education, they were investing in physical infrastructure. And to that last point, really, when you have a political setting like you have in China, it's rather somewhat easier to mobilize the troops, so to speak, to focus on a goal, as opposed to other settings where let's say there's less central control and central prioritization and central resource allocation, right? So it's a combination, I think, of a very strong government combined with these investments, and I think an appreciation of the government, and that's partly the reason they're over-fertilizing, that we simply cannot to have a food insecure country. The impact that would have on political and social stability in China if the country starts to go short of rice or wheat or any of the other, or even meat now, is disastrous for a country like China and for the political future of the party. Yeah, and that's why in Asia, and the history of Syria, and as a trigger to what's gone on there. You just have to look 2007, 2008, when the world food prices all went up. They spiked in about 50 cities around the world. There were riots. People don't like it when their basic requirement, i.e. food, when the price of it goes up, and they will go on a rampage. And that's why for years countries like Indonesia, the Philippines, they pay a lot of attention to food security, even at the and national food self-sufficiency, even if the World Bank might advise them, no, just import it, it's not a problem. I'm having the same questions with East Timor. Whether I actually have a case that I teach in my class where we think about whether a country like East Timor should even be worried about agriculture. Why not just import all your food? Because they've got oil, right? They've got $17 billion in their petroleum account and only 1.2 million people. Why is Qatar and Kuwait and places like that, why are they investing in land in Africa? They're looking to food security in different ways.
As we hopefully decrease the amount of malnutrition, within the scheme of talking about nutrition, you've been saying that overnutrition is going to be an issue. How much of a prominent issue do you think this is going to be in terms of all the global issues there are in the future? And do you think that our measures of overnutrition are ready for that challenge at the moment? For example, BMI, we all know it's downfall and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, until somebody comes up with something clearly better and more practical than BMI, we're kind of stuck with that. So I think the general, the consensus is it's a reasonable approximation for the, I'm definitely overweight, but I don't feel I'm that overweight, but the BMI doesn't lie, right? So just these heavy bones that really give me a hard time. Go through the goals, the 169 targets, and now the 300 plus indicators, and there is not a single mention of overweight. I'm astonished. Yes, it's buried under all forms of malnutrition. So you could say, well, of course that includes overweight and obesity. One of the new indicators refers to children under 5 overweight, so the sort of the infant overweight piece. But there's no mention of adult overweight or obesity. It may be because most of the guys in the UN Open Working Group were feeling a bit uncomfortable about, bringing it to the surface in the discussions. But really, I'm astounded at that. That never came out of that. So I personally think not enough attention is being paid to that. It's indirectly covered if you go to the health goal and they talk about non-communicable diseases and they talk about hypertension and diabetes and these things. So the diseases that come from the overweight and ultimately the obesity problem are mentioned, but the actual core of it is not. So I think there's work to be done there, and I think there will be some advocacy around that going forward.
One aspect you touched on quite briefly is something which is becoming a huge problem in countries like India, which is farmers' suicides.
Yes.
And maybe because of climate change, the frequency with which we come across monsoon failures and subsequently droughts increasing so much. And I suspect that the statistics on farmers' suicides is very understated because of the fact that it's not high on the political agenda. At the global level, and I suspect it's a problem in other countries too, at the global level, is there anything built into the SDGs which specifically targets the requirements for income support, for smoothing income for farmers at a time of monsoon failures? Now,
No, so it's a great point. I don't have the answer to that. There is an indicator there on suicide now under the health SDG. It wasn't part of the MDGs at all. But essentially, I think part of SDG2 has to be improving sustainability and resilience. I think that the resilience part is often lost and somehow assumed under sustainability, but I think some writers are now like making it clear that that's actually something different. And clearly the people's vulnerability to suicide should be the objective of any resilience program. How do we have safety nets that, I think your examples from India, the problems of debt seem to be the major driver, but debt is linked to climate, right? So if you have a crop failure and you've borrowed and there's no way out of this thing, I haven't sort of looked into it personally, but I know there are policies now going into place. I think Maharashtra, a few of the states are starting to incorporate this into their sort of social welfare programs, but probably not. I mean, if we can't get our act together in New South Wales, how do we handle massive states of 100 million people? It's really a big challenge. But I think it's something we just haven't thought about that much. And I don't think the researchers have put a lot of thought into this, because I've really struggled to find evidence other than often anecdotal evidence. And some of it's a bit flimsy because, another case in India is a lot of times I've seen when you look for farmer suicides that it always gets linked to Monsanto. And then I've tried to go a bit deeper, and there really is no evidence that directly links that to the adoption of new technologies. If anything, it's not being able to come up with some more resilient technologies that's led to this problem of suicide, and the absence of sort of proper social support systems that enable people to sort of take a breather and realize there's another, you can come back and fight again next season. People see it's hopeless otherwise. Yeah.
In the implementation slide, you mentioned that behavioral change is a big factor for implementation.
Right.
So how do you expedite, or how is behavioral change done? Are there policies? Is it the communications? What tools are used? And is there a time limit for behavioral change?
Well, that's a very broad question. 2 years ago, the World Development Report focused on behavioral change, on the role of behavioral change in bringing about good development outcomes. I think if we look at a number of the problems that I talked about today, and two of them in particular, I think one is diet, what people eat, and another one is food waste. So there's two very good examples, I think, of where what they call these days nudges, that you can nudge people towards changing their behavior. It means you've really got to work across the board. You've got to, first of all, you've got to identify what the core problem is, so you know what behavior you're really wanting to change. Are you playing around with the symptoms, or are you dealing with the core of it? You need to see how can we educate folks to understand that something's important. And then you have to put policies in place so that they can respond to a desire to behave differently. If where I live now in New York, if you go to the Bronx, you totally understand why it's very difficult for people to eat enough fruits and vegetables. There aren't many places. Not only is it expensive, and people have relatively no incomes, there are relatively few places you can go to actually access that, even if you were convinced with all the advocacy work that we need to have 5 helpings of fruit and vegetable each day. So you need to have sort of these concurrent things going. So the New York City, what they've done is start to introduce food carts into those areas. So it's the nudge is coming from the public sector, actually investing in making sure people have access to those things. They're going into the schools and particularly starting young. A lot of behavior starts young, right? So whether it's food waste or diets, you learn it when you're young. So getting healthy diets onto the trays, you know, when you're eating. I mean, in New York, for example, kids get breakfasts I think it's required now in all public schools. So that needs to be healthy. You know, taking the soda dispensers out of schools. You know, just labels on processed and packaged products. There's a whole lot of things like that I think collectively are